This will be a video about Joshua Whitehead's novel Jonny Appleseed, particularly to talk about identity construction, and I'll put that together with the research topics and talk about how to think about framing your research paper and how to develop a thesis. Okay, so this novel is a lot about the exploration of identity of the main character, Jonny. And as we quickly realize, he is gay, queer, two-spirit. Okay, and this becomes a kind of terminological question for us. How do we define Jonny as readers, and how does Jonny define himself? And so this is where we can, start to think about the ways in which we deal with these topics in culture. So in the culture of literature, creative arts, Whitehead is writing this novel to explore how to construct identity through the novel form. Okay, and we can read the novel and try and understand what motivates this character and his experiences in the world. At the same time, we can have more academic approaches, and this is sort of the intersection of creative arts and university study, right? Is that how do we bring academic thought, systemic thought, critical thought to the creative arts? And so in this case, we're studying a novel about identity. So what kinds of tools do we have as sophisticated critical readers of the text to try and understand what Whitehead is doing? And so when we think about this in sort of general terms, and forgive me if I'm overly simplistic here, but I do it for effect, is that sometimes students will write on quote-unquote controversial subjects like race or homosexuality or something like that, and say, if we take race, I when I look at someone, I don't see race, I just see a person. Or they'll say, I don't care who the person is, I just see a person. Or perhaps more specifically, I don't care about sexual orientation, it's none of my business, I just accept them for who they are. And I often take issue with this kind of simple position, because what it does is it essentially ignores difference, okay? That if we put it in terms of race, okay, well, there's a black person and a white person, and what happens here is we say, I don't see a black person or a white person, I just see a person. And so what we do is we ignore the difference of race. Now, race is one that's visually marked, that for me to say, well, I don't see a black person is kind of disingenuous. It's like, can you not see that person has black skin? Like, it's not some mystery. Now we can choose to ignore it, but that's a deliberate, conscious choice. It's not that we don't see it, it's that we choose not to make anything out of it. This particular brand of reasoning is called color blindness. That is, we don't see, or we pretend we don't see color. And what that does is it ignores difference, it glosses over it. Okay, and that can have its own perhaps problematic effects. Now, something like sexual orientation is something that is not marked visibly, okay? That we can look at a person, we can't tell if they're straight or gay or whatever, okay? And so we just say, well, I don't really care who they go home with, doesn't matter to me. And so again, we don't draw attention to sexual orientation, we just accept the person for who they are, and that's the end of it. So a bit of this is like, well, we won't even ask about difference, we'll just assume nothing. And so again, it's a kind of ignoring of the question. So it's not like you're going to go up to people, are you straight or gay? But the point is that by not making anything of it, we in essence avoid the question, or even the investigation or the consideration of the question, and that can lead to neglect or ignorance or other damaging situations. So in terms of writing essays, what I'm getting at here is, try not to write an essay that has a thesis of, we should just accept people for who they are, okay, without critically examining the reasons why we would want to do that, okay? That on what terms are we accepting a person, okay? Are we accepting on the basis of, I don't see color? Or are we accepting on the basis of, I recognize that you're black, but we make a conscious decision not to make racially inflected judgments here. Okay? And in stark terms, one is a decision based on ignorance or denial, the other is based on acceptance, okay, and rejection of, say, race-based attitudes that have no place in an inclusive or just or equal society, okay? It may appear the same, but the outcome is quite different, okay? So I've linked on Blackboard a link to an academic text that talks about the origins of two-spirit identity in Indigenous culture, and I invite you to go and read that because it serves as a kind of example text of what we can do academically with these kinds of terms. So, it's on Google Books, so there's a bunch of pages from there, but the introduction to that book is there in its entirety, and so it's worth reading that to get a sense of how academics deal with this question, right? If we're not just going to be content to reject it and say, well, I don't see color, or I don't see sexual orientation, how do we actually engage, how do we develop terminology in order to talk about these issues that are perhaps, uncomfortable or objectionable or controversial to people, right? That we have, I think, an intellectual obligation to think about these things. This is what we do in post-secondary education. Okay, so for example, it starts off by talking a little bit about the term burdash or bardash, depending on what version of it you're looking at, and it sort of goes into the history of that term to say, this was originally what anthropologists agreed upon, but if you trace it back, it's got its very specific origins in kind of homosexual relations between men and boys who were kept for homosexual purposes, and they're like, this isn't necessarily an appropriate term to be using across the board for, say, Indigenous people in North America who have a different idea of non-binary genders, okay? And so it talks about this, saying, the dominant attitude in a lot of places in the world is that there are two genders, male and female, but there's also lots of examples. It's certainly not everywhere, but there are lots of examples where there are non-binary, that is, their third or fourth or fifth terms outside the male-female binary. So what is the appropriate terminology that we can have? Initially it was bardash. Now we realize that that's perhaps a pejorative or negative term, that we don't want to use that anymore. And so it talks about, the development of these terms. Okay. And then it talks about, cross-cultural problems with developing these terms. And so it says, two-spirit is one that people have talked about, and that's the title of the book. And it says, how do we go about using this term? And it says at one point, that we shouldn't translate two-spirit into Indigenous languages, right? Because what that's doing is it's taking a white system of thought and a white term and translating it into an Indigenous language, and there can be all sorts of translation errors and cultural conflicts that might arise because of the difference in terminology. So we don't want to import yet another term into an Indigenous language, that we could think about it in simple terms, just the other way around. What were the terms that the Indigenous languages had for this non-binary gender? Can we translate those into English? And so we see in terms of gender and sexuality a kind of case example of all sorts of things that we could talk about with culture. That we don't want to take the idea of homosexuality, which in, say, Euro-colonial history is kind of a hush-hush, quiet, closeted idea where nobody really talks about it. It's not socially accepted. We don't want to take that with all its baggage and say, oh, you're a gay Indigenous person, because it's got that history that may not be appropriate for the culture that we are projecting it onto, okay? But the book also, intelligently points out that there isn't some, romanticized Indian past where everybody was accepted. It points out that, in some cultures, two-spirit people were accepted, but there's also lots of examples of homophobia even within Indigenous cultures. So, there isn't some utopian ideal that's as much of a fallacy as any other negative fallacy, right? So this is, the nature of academic thinking, is that we want to think about it from as many angles as possible to say, okay, what's the most appropriate way to talk about this subject given the situation that we're in right now. We used to use this, that's not appropriate. How can we develop a terminology that's not discriminatory, not negative, not condescending?